I thought I knew what loneliness felt like. Growing up in Sao Paulo, watching everyone around me build families while I remained alone, that was one kind of lonely. But standing in a North Carolina kitchen at 5 in the morning, scrubbing dishes until my hands bled, married to a man who barely looked at me, surrounded by his family who treated me like I was invisible unless they needed something cleaned or cooked or carried, that was a different kind of lonely altogether. The kind that makes you forget your own name. The kind that turns you into a ghost in your own life. By the time I realized my marriage wasn't a love story but a trap, I'd already lost everything I came here looking for. Everything except the will to escape. Leticia Silva stood at the baggage claim of Piedmont Triad International Airport, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the handle of her worn suitcase. The fluorescent lights above hummed with an unfamiliar frequency, different from the airports back home in Sao Paulo. At 32 years old, she had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the past 6 months, the moment she would finally step into her new life as Mrs. Leticia Morrison. The air conditioning was stronger than she expected, raising goosebumps on her arms despite the late August heat she knew waited outside. Through the glass walls, she could see the North Carolina sun beating down on the parking lot, creating waves of heat that distorted the air. It reminded her of summer afternoons in Brazil, but something felt fundamentally different here. The landscape was flatter, the trees a different shade of green, the sky somehow wider and emptier. "Letty!" The voice cut through her anxious thoughts. She turned to see Daniel Morrison walking toward her with that same confident smile that had captured her heart 18 months ago at a business conference in Rio de Janeiro. He was 45, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying temples that gave him a distinguished look. His blue eyes had seemed kind when they first met, almost gentle. He wore khaki pants and a polo shirt, looking every bit the successful American businessman he claimed to be. "You made it," he said, pulling her into an embrace that felt stiff, almost perfunctory. Nothing like the passionate hugs they'd shared during his 3 visits to Brazil. "I was so nervous the whole flight," Leticia admitted, her English carefully measured. She had spent the last year improving her language skills, watching American movies, taking online classes, determined to fit into this new world. 14 hours is a long time to think. "Well, stop thinking and start living," Daniel said, grabbing her suitcase. "The family is excited to meet you. Mom's been cooking all day." The family. During their courtship, Daniel had painted idyllic pictures of his mother Margaret, his younger brother Ryan, and Ryan's wife Jessica. He described Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, made it sound warm and welcoming. A stark contrast to Leticia's own fractured family. Her mother had passed away from cancer 3 years ago, her father had remarried and moved to Portugal, and her only sister lived in Vancouver with her Canadian husband. Leticia had felt alone in Sao Paulo, working as a receptionist at a medical clinic, living in a small apartment in Tatuapé, watching friends marry and start families while she remained single. When Daniel entered her life with his American charm and promises of a better future, it felt like fate finally smiling upon her. The drive from Greensboro to the Morrison family home in the suburbs of Winston-Salem took 40 minutes. Daniel talked the entire time about his work managing a supply chain for a furniture manufacturing company, about the house they would eventually buy, about the life they would build together. Leticia watched the landscape change from highway to smaller roads, from commercial strips to residential areas, with sprawling lawns and houses that seemed enormous compared to Sao Paulo apartments. "We'll stay with Mom for a few months," Daniel explained as they turned onto a tree-lined street. "Just until we save enough for a down payment on our own place. She's got plenty of room, and it'll give you time to adjust." A few months. That seemed reasonable. Leticia had left everything behind. Her job, her apartment, her friends, her country. A transition period made sense. The Morrison house was a 2-story colonial-style home painted pale yellow with white shutters. The lawn was meticulously maintained, bordered by azalea bushes and maple trees that cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. An American flag hung limply from a pole near the front door. As Daniel pulled into the driveway, the front door opened. A woman in her late 60s stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. Margaret Morrison was shorter than Leticia expected, with steel gray hair cut in a practical bob and eyes that assessed Leticia with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "So this is the Brazilian girl," Margaret said, her voice flat and measured. "Not daughter-in-law. Not Leticia. Just the Brazilian girl." "Mom, this is Leticia," Daniel said, seemingly oblivious to his mother's cold tone. "Letty, this is my mother, Margaret. Letitia extended her hand, a smile carefully arranged on her face. Mrs. Morrison, it's so wonderful to finally meet you. Daniel has told me so many beautiful things about you. Margaret looked at the extended hand for a moment before giving it a brief, limp shake. Her palm was cool and dry. I hope you're not expecting any special treatment, she said. We're simple people here. We work for what we have. The words hung in the humid air like a warning Letitia didn't yet know how to interpret. She felt Daniel tense beside her, saw something flicker across his face. Embarrassment? Annoyance? But it passed so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. Of course, Letitia said, her smile wavering. I'm just grateful to be here, to start our life together. Margaret's eyes moved from Letitia to her son, then back again. Dinner's in an hour, she said. Daniel, show her to your room. And tell her the house rules. As Margaret turned and walked back inside, Letitia felt the first whisper of unease crawl up her spine. The promised warmth was nowhere to be found. The welcome she'd imagined, flowers perhaps, or at least a genuine smile, had been replaced with cold assessment and barely concealed disapproval. Daniel picked up her suitcase. Don't worry about Mom, he said quietly. She's just protective. She'll warm up to you. But as Letitia followed him into the house, crossing the threshold into her new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like a lock engaging. She told herself she was being paranoid. That jet lag and nerves were making her imagine threats where none existed. She was wrong. Chapter 2. The First Cracks. Word count. 1,450 words. Letitia woke at 5:30 in the morning to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She'd barely slept, her body still confused by the time difference, her mind racing with memories of the previous evening's dinner. It had been awkward and tense, with Margaret asking pointed questions about Letitia's education. Just high school? Her work experience? A receptionist. How impractical. And her family. So you're essentially alone in this world. Daniel had said little, focused on his plate of pot roast and mashed potatoes, occasionally murmuring agreement with his mother's observations. Ryan and Jessica hadn't come to dinner. They lived in their own home 10 minutes away. So it had been just the three of them at a dining table that could seat 10, the empty chairs somehow emphasizing Letitia's isolation. Now, lying in Daniel's childhood bedroom with its outdated plaid curtains and trophies from high school football, Letitia heard sounds from downstairs. Cabinets opening and closing, water running, the beep of a coffee maker. Daniel was still asleep beside her, his back turned, his breathing deep and even. They hadn't made love last night. He'd claimed exhaustion from work, kissed her forehead, and fallen asleep within minutes. Their wedding night in the small courthouse ceremony 3 weeks ago in São Paulo had been similarly disappointing. Quick, mechanical, nothing like the passion he'd shown during their courtship. Letitia slipped out of bed, pulled on a robe over her nightgown, and quietly made her way downstairs. The wooden steps creaked under her feet, announcing her presence. Margaret stood in the kitchen, already dressed in slacks and a cardigan despite the early hour. She turned as Letitia entered, her expression neutral. "You're up," she observed, as if this were somehow unexpected or inappropriate. "I couldn't sleep," Letitia admitted. "The time change." "Coffee's ready," Margaret said, gesturing to the pot. "Mugs are in the cabinet above the sink." Letitia moved to retrieve a mug, grateful for something to do with her hands. The kitchen was large and dated, with oak cabinets and countertops that had probably been installed in the 1990s. Everything was immaculate, not a dish out of place, no crumbs on the counters. Through the window above the sink, she could see the backyard with its neatly trimmed grass and a wooden deck that needed staining. "In this house, we have routines," Margaret said as Letitia poured her coffee. "I rise at 5:30. Breakfast is at 7 sharp. Daniel needs to leave for work by 7:45. Dinner is at 6:30. We don't eat in front of the television and we clean our plates." Letitia nodded, cradling the warm mug in her hands. "Of course. I understand. Do you?" Margaret's eyes fixed on her with that same assessing look from yesterday. "Because where you come from, I imagine things are quite different. More casual." There was something in the way she said casual that felt like an insult. Letitia kept her expression carefully neutral. "Every home has its own ways," she said. "I'm happy to learn yours." Margaret took a sip of her coffee, studying Letitia over the rim. Daniel tells me you're going to look for work. As what, exactly? I thought perhaps receptionist work again, or maybe retail while I improve my English. Your English needs considerable improvement, Margaret interrupted. And American businesses have standards. You'll need proper credentials, references. Do you have any of that? Letitia felt heat rise to her cheeks. I have my work history from Brazil, which means nothing here. Margaret set down her mug with a definitive clink. But perhaps that's for the best. Daniel works long hours, and someone needs to help maintain this household. I'm not as young as I used to be, and this house doesn't clean itself. The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Of course I can help with housework, Letitia said slowly. While I look for employment. We'll see about employment, Margaret said dismissively. For now, let's focus on you earning your keep. The laundry room is through that door. There are 3 loads that need to be done today. The bathroom upstairs needs a deep clean. Daniel tracks in dirt something terrible. And I'll need the kitchen floors mopped after breakfast. Leticia stared at her, coffee forgotten. Today? Is there a problem? No, I thought maybe I would spend the day settling in. Perhaps Daniel and I could. Daniel has work, Margaret said firmly. And idle hands are the devil's workshop, as my mother used to say. You're family now, which means you contribute. That's how we do things here. Before Letitia could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Daniel appeared, already dressed for work in slacks and a button-down shirt. He went straight to his mother, kissing her cheek. Morning, Mom. Good morning, sweetheart. Breakfast will be ready soon. He turned to Leticia, giving her a brief smile. You're up early. I couldn't sleep, she said, searching his face for warmth, for connection. Daniel, I was hoping maybe today we could. Can't today, babe. Big meeting with corporate. Probably won't be home until late. He poured himself coffee. Mom, you'll show Letty the ropes, right? Help her get settled? Already started, Margaret said, her smile thin. Letitia wanted to pull Daniel aside, to tell him that something felt wrong, that his mother's welcome was anything but welcoming. But he was already scrolling through his phone, distracted, and Margaret was watching her with those sharp eyes. I'll make breakfast, Letitia offered, trying to find her footing. What would you like? I've already started the eggs and bacon, Margaret said. But you can set the table. Plates are in that cabinet, silverware in the drawer by the dishwasher. 3 settings. As Leticia moved to comply, she felt the dynamic settling into place like a heavy blanket. She was not a new bride being welcomed into a family. She was not a daughter-in-law to be cherished. She was something else entirely, something that made her throat tight with a fear she couldn't quite name. Breakfast was quiet, except for Margaret's running commentary on neighborhood news and Daniel's work schedule. Letitia ate mechanically, the scrambled eggs tasteless in her mouth. When Daniel stood to leave, she followed him to the door. Have a good day, she said softly, touching his arm. He kissed her forehead, distracted. You too. Help Mom out, okay? She's doing us a favor letting us stay here. Us. But it didn't feel like us. It felt like Leticia was alone in this house with a woman who looked at her like an inconvenience at best, an intruder at worst. After Daniel left, Letitia returned to the kitchen to find Margaret already stacking dishes. Those loads of laundry won't do themselves, Margaret said without looking at her. Washer and dryer are in the basement. Sort by colors. Use cold water for darks, hot for whites and towels. Fabric softener is on the shelf. Mrs. Morrison. Margaret is fine. We're family now, after all. The word family sounded almost mocking. Letitia spent the rest of the morning in the basement, a dim, musty space with concrete floors and exposed pipes. She sorted through hampers of clothes, Daniel's work shirts, Margaret's sensible undergarments, towels and sheets, and things that clearly hadn't been washed in weeks. Her hands grew red from the hot water and detergent, her back aching from bending over the machines. By afternoon, she'd cleaned the upstairs bathroom until it sparkled, mopped the kitchen floor, and vacuumed the living room. Margaret appeared periodically, running a finger along surfaces, checking corners, always finding something that needed more attention. In Brazil, you might have been used to lax standards, Margaret said, inspecting the bathroom. But we believe in cleanliness being next to godliness here. Letitia bit back a response about how her apartment in São Paulo had been immaculate, how she'd always taken pride in her home. There was no point. Margaret had already decided who Letitia was, what she represented. That night, when Daniel finally came home at 8:30, long after dinner had been eaten and dishes washed, Letitia tried to talk to him in the privacy of their room. "Your mother has me doing a lot of housework," she said carefully. "I want to help, but I also need to look for a job, to start building our life." "Mom said you'd complain," Daniel interrupted, loosening his tie. "Look, we're living in her house rent-free. The least we can do is help out. She's not getting any younger, Letty. Try to be more understanding." "I am understanding, but I'm exhausted," he said, cutting her off. "Can we not do this tonight? Just try to get along with her, okay?" "For me?" He turned away, pulling off his shirt, and Letitia felt something crack inside her chest. This wasn't the man who had courted her in Brazil, who had whispered promises of partnership and love. This was someone else, someone who looked at her with mild annoyance when she expressed needs or concerns. She lay awake that night listening to Daniel snore beside her and wondered how she had gotten here. Wondered if the warning signs had been there all along and she'd been too desperate, too lonely, too ready to believe in fairy tales to see them. The house settled around her with creaks and groans, unfamiliar sounds in an unfamiliar place. Through the window, she could see streetlights casting orange pools on the quiet suburban street. Everything looked peaceful from here, safe, normal. But Letitia was beginning to understand that appearances meant nothing, and that her real nightmare was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Expansion. Word count: 1,600 words. 3 weeks into her new life in North Carolina, Letitia woke at 5:15, 15 minutes before Margaret's alarm, so she could have the coffee ready and breakfast started before her mother-in-law came downstairs. She'd learned quickly that Margaret's approval, however sparse, came from anticipating needs before they were voiced. The September morning was cooler now, a hint of autumn in the air that reminded Letitia of nothing in Brazil. She wrapped a cardigan around herself and padded downstairs in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with practiced quiet through the kitchen she'd come to know intimately. 3 weeks. In that time, she'd cleaned every corner of the house, done countless loads of laundry, cooked meals under Margaret's critical supervision, and slowly, methodically, watched her dreams of American life dissolve like sugar in hot coffee. Daniel left early and came home late. When he was home, he was either tired or distracted, scrolling through his phone, watching television, treating Letitia like a roommate rather than a wife. They hadn't been intimate since arriving in North Carolina. He always had an excuse. Exhausted from work, stressed about a project, not feeling well. Letitia had tried to discuss finding work, but Margaret always had reasons why it wasn't the right time. "Your English needs improvement. You don't understand American workplace culture. Daniel needs you here," supporting him. And Daniel, whenever Letitia brought it up, would sigh and say, "Let's just get through the holidays first. There's no rush." But there was a rush. Letitia could feel it in the way her identity was slipping away, day by day, replaced by something smaller, something that existed only to serve others. She'd just finished scrambling eggs when she heard Margaret's footsteps on the stairs. Right on schedule. "Good morning," Letitia said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Coffee's ready, and I'm making your eggs just how you like them. Well done with a little pepper." Margaret examined the pan, gave a small nod. "They'll do. Set the table for 5 this morning. Ryan and Jessica are coming over with the kids. Family breakfast before church." Letitia's hands stilled. 5? Did I stutter? Margaret opened the refrigerator. "We'll need bacon, toast, orange juice. I trust you can manage that." Church. Letitia had been attending for the past 2 Sundays, sitting in the pew between Daniel and Margaret at First Baptist Church of Winston-Salem. The services were long and conducted in English she still struggled to fully comprehend, the hymns unfamiliar, the congregation politely distant. People smiled and said hello, but never asked questions, never tried to know her beyond surface pleasantries. Margaret belonged to the Women's Fellowship and the Thursday Bible Study group. She'd made it clear that Letitia would be expected to attend these as well, to integrate properly into the community. At 7:30, Ryan Morrison arrived with his family. He was 39, 3 years younger than Daniel, but with the same broad build and sandy hair, though his was thinning at the crown. His wife Jessica was petite and blonde, with a tight smile and eyes that assessed everything. Their 2 children, Madison, 7, and Braden, 5, ran into the house with the casual entitlement of children who considered this space their own. "Something smells good," Ryan said, kissing his mother's cheek. The Brazilian girl can cook, huh? Letitia stood by the stove, spatula in hand, that phrase hitting her like a slap. The Brazilian girl. Not Letitia, not Daniel's wife, not even her sister-in-law. Letitia, Daniel said mildly from his seat at the table. Her name is Letitia. Right, sorry, Ryan said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. Hard to pronounce. Leticia, Letitia said clearly, meeting his eyes. It's not difficult. Something flickered in Ryan's expression. Surprise, maybe, that she'd corrected him. Jessica laughed, a high tinkling sound. Well, aren't you feisty this morning? Letitia turned back to the stove, jaw tight. She'd been nothing but accommodating, nothing but grateful and polite. And still they treated her like an amusing novelty at best, an inconvenience at worst. Breakfast was chaotic. Madison and Braden demanded specific foods, complained about what was served, spilled juice that Letitia had to clean up. Jessica sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, not once helping or disciplining her children. Ryan dominated the conversation, talking about his car dealership and making jokes at Daniel's expense. Still living with mommy, huh? Ryan needled. When you gonna get your own place, big brother? We're saving, Daniel said stiffly. For how long? You've got a wife now, man. Gotta provide. Margaret intervened smoothly. Daniel is being smart with his money, unlike some people who bought a house they could barely afford. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Family dynamics, Letitia was learning, were a minefield of old resentments and unspoken hierarchies. After breakfast, as everyone prepared for church, Jessica cornered Letitia in the kitchen. You're cleaning this up, right? She asked, gesturing to the disaster of plates and spilled food. We need to leave for church in 20 minutes, Letitia said carefully. Plenty of time for a quick clean. We can't leave the kitchen like this. Jessica's smile was sweet, her tone reasonable, but her eyes were hard. I'd help, but I need to get the kids ready. You understand. Letitia looked at the mess, then at the clock. She understood perfectly. She was the servant, and servants cleaned up after others. By the time she'd loaded the dishwasher and wiped down surfaces, the family was already in the car, waiting. She rushed upstairs, changed into her only church dress, a modest navy blue number she'd brought from Brazil, and hurried to join them. Margaret looked her up and down critically. That dress is a bit fitted, don't you think? We're going to church, not a nightclub. Heat flooded Letitia's face. The dress was perfectly appropriate, conservative even. But she saw Jessica smirking in the back seat, Ryan pretending not to listen. Daniel said nothing in her defense. The church service blurred past, words and music that Letitia barely registered. She sat rigidly in the pew, feeling the weight of eyes on her. The foreign woman, the outsider, the one who'd married into the Morrison family and now had to prove herself worthy. After service, during the coffee hour in the fellowship hall, women from Margaret's circles descended on Letitia with questions that felt more like interrogations. Where exactly was she from? How did she meet Daniel? What did her family do? The questions came rapid fire, leaving little time for complete answers, judging her accent, her hesitations, her attempts to explain a life they couldn't begin to understand. Well, aren't you brave moving all this way? One woman said, her tone suggesting stupidity rather than bravery. I could never leave my home like that. Love makes people do crazy things, another added with a knowing look. Letitia excused herself to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall, breathing deeply. Through the thin walls, she heard two women talking at the sinks. Margaret says she doesn't know what Daniel was thinking, marrying someone like that. Like what? She seems sweet enough. You know, foreign, no education, no family. Margaret thinks she was just looking for a green card. Well, she certainly landed on her feet, didn't she? Living in that nice house, not working. Margaret has her working plenty, from what I hear. Cleaning, cooking, earning her keep. Laughter, running water, then silence as they left. Letitia stared at the stall door, at the graffiti scratched into the paint, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. They all thought she was a gold digger, an opportunist who'd trapped Daniel into marriage. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. The afternoon brought more family obligation. Jessica needed help watching the kids while she ran errands. Could Letitia do it? Of course she could. She had nothing else planned. So Leticia spent 3 hours at Ryan and Jessica's home, a sprawling ranch house with toys scattered everywhere and dishes piled in the sink, entertaining two children who alternated between ignoring her and demanding things. Madison kept correcting her English, mimicking her accent. Braden threw a tantrum when she couldn't understand his request for a specific snack. When Jessica returned, she barely thanked Leticia. "Oh, you're still here. I thought you'd have taken them back to Margaret's by now." That evening, back at Margaret's house, Leticia helped prepare Sunday dinner. It had become a tradition, the whole family gathering every Sunday, with Leticia doing most of the cooking and all of the cleaning while everyone else relaxed. As she stood at the sink washing dishes, watching through the window as Daniel and Ryan threw a football in the backyard, she felt the walls of her life closing in. This was her routine now. Wake early, clean, cook, serve, clean again, go to bed exhausted. Repeat. No job search, no friends, no independence, no husband, not really. Just a man she lived with who treated her like a burden he'd been saddled with. She'd come to America believing in promises of love and partnership. Instead, she'd become exactly what the title predicted, a servant to his entire family. That night, lying in the darkness beside Daniel's sleeping form, Leticia allowed herself to cry for the first time since arriving in North Carolina. Silent tears that soaked into her pillow, grief for everything she'd lost and the trap she'd walked into with eyes wide open, too desperate to see the truth. In São Paulo, she'd been lonely but free. Here, she was neither, and she had no idea how to escape. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. Word count: 1,550 words. October arrived with crisp mornings and leaves turning gold and crimson. Leticia had been in North Carolina for 2 months, and the initial shock had settled into a numb routine of servitude. She woke before dawn, worked until late evening, and fell into bed exhausted, her days blurring together in an endless cycle of labor. The family had expanded their expectations systematically. Margaret now gave her detailed cleaning schedules. Monday was deep clean the bathrooms, Tuesday was laundry and ironing, Wednesday was grocery shopping and meal prep, Thursday was windows and dusting, Friday was floors throughout the house. Weekends were for family obligations, Sunday dinners, babysitting Ryan's kids, driving Margaret to her various social engagements. Leticia's English had improved through necessity, but her confidence had deteriorated. Every mistake was noted, every mispronounced word corrected with barely concealed irritation. She'd stopped trying to make friends, stopped suggesting activities with Daniel, stopped hoping for change. Her phone calls home to Brazil had become less frequent. What could she tell her sister Marina? That her marriage was a sham? That she'd traded her freedom for a prison disguised as suburban respectability? Marina would tell her to leave, to come home, but Leticia had no money for a ticket, no savings, nothing of her own. Daniel controlled everything financial. She'd asked him once for access to their bank account, and he'd looked at her like she'd requested something absurd. "What do you need money for?" he'd asked. "Mom buys the groceries and you have everything you need here. Everything except dignity, everything except autonomy, everything except love." On a Tuesday morning in mid-October, Margaret announced that her sister Barbara would be visiting from Charlotte for a week. "She'll stay in the guest room," Margaret said. "You'll need to prepare it. Fresh linens, clean towels, dust everything thoroughly. Barbara has allergies, so be especially careful." Another person to serve. Another voice to criticize and command. Barbara arrived that Friday evening, a larger, louder version of Margaret with the same calculating eyes. She embraced her sister warmly, greeted Daniel and Ryan with affection, and looked at Leticia with barely concealed contempt. "So you're the foreign wife," Barbara said, not extending her hand. "Margaret's told me all about you." Leticia could imagine exactly what Margaret had said. "It's nice to meet you," she replied, her voice flat. "We'll see," Barbara said cryptically. That week became a masterclass in humiliation. Barbara treated Leticia like hired help, snapping fingers for coffee, leaving messes deliberately, complaining loudly about the quality of everything Leticia did. And Margaret, perhaps performing for her sister, became even more demanding. "The bathroom isn't clean enough." Barbara found a hair in the sink. "These eggs are overcooked. Make fresh ones." "Your accent is so thick, Barbara can barely understand you. Speak more clearly." Daniel, as always, was absent or indifferent. When Leticia tried to talk to him privately, he accused her of being dramatic. "They're just old-fashioned. Stop being so sensitive. Not everything is an attack." But it was an attack. A systematic breaking down of her spirit, her sense of self, her humanity. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening. Letitia had spent all day preparing an elaborate dinner. Barbara had requested beef stroganoff, a dish that took hours of preparation. She'd shopped for ingredients using money from the household envelope, carefully followed a recipe she'd found online, and spent the afternoon cooking while also managing her regular cleaning duties. The family gathered at 6:30. Margaret, Barbara, Daniel, Ryan, Jessica, and the kids. 8 people around the dining table, with Leticia serving. She'd just set down the serving dish when Barbara took one bite and made a face. "This is terrible," she announced. "What did you do to it?" Leticia felt her stomach drop. "I followed the recipe exactly." "Beef stroganoff shouldn't taste like this," Barbara interrupted. "It's bland and the meat is tough. Margaret, you really need to teach her basic cooking skills." "I've tried," Margaret said with a long-suffering sigh. "But you can't teach someone who doesn't want to learn." "I do want to learn," Leticia protested, her voice shaking. "I spent all day." "All day, and this is what you produce?" Jessica chimed in. "I could have made this in an hour and it would have tasted better." Ryan laughed. "Maybe we should just order pizza." The children, sensing the adults' mood, began chanting, "Pizza! Pizza!" Letitia looked at Daniel, silently begging him to defend her, to say something. Anything. He was staring at his plate, jaw tight, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. "I'm sorry," Letitia said quietly. "I'll try again." "Don't bother," Barbara said dismissively. "Just go order pizza. Surely you can manage that without ruining it." Something inside Letitia snapped. "No," she said. The table fell silent. Everyone stared at her. "What did you say?" Margaret's voice was ice. "No," Letitia repeated, her voice stronger now. "I won't order pizza. I spent hours making this meal. If you don't like it, you're welcome to cook something yourself." Barbara's mouth fell open. Jessica gasped. Ryan looked genuinely shocked. Margaret stood slowly, her face flushed. "How dare you speak to us that way in my house? It's not just your house," Letitia said, feeling months of suppressed rage bubbling up. "Daniel lives here too, which means I live here too. I'm not your servant. I'm not your maid. I'm your daughter-in-law, and I deserve basic respect." "Daniel," Margaret turned to her son, "are you going to let her talk to me like this?" All eyes turned to Daniel. This was his moment, Letitia thought. His chance to finally stand up for her, to be the partner he'd promised to be. He looked at Letitia, and she saw something in his eyes that chilled her to the core. Not support. Not love. Resentment. "Apologize to my mother," he said quietly. The words hit Letitia like a physical blow. "What?" "You heard me. Apologize. You're out of line." "I'm out of line?" Letitia's voice rose. "I wake up at 5:15 every morning. I clean this entire house. I cook every meal. I do everyone's laundry. I watch Ryan's kids. I drive your mother everywhere she needs to go. I do everything asked of me and more, and I'm still treated like I'm worthless. When is it enough? When do I get to be treated like a human being? You're being dramatic. I'm being honest." Tears were streaming down her face now, months of pain pouring out. "This isn't what you promised me, Daniel. You said we'd build a life together. You said you loved me. But you've let them turn me into unpaid labor, and you've done nothing to stop it." "Maybe if you actually contributed something," Margaret said coldly, "instead of complaining all the time." "Contributed?" Letitia whirled on her. "What exactly do you think I've been doing? What do you call cooking and cleaning and serving everyone constantly?" "You're living in my house rent-free," Margaret shot back. "The least you can do is help maintain it." "Help? I'm the only one maintaining it. You sit around all day with your friends while I do everything." "Daniel," Margaret said sharply, "control your wife." And there it was. The truth laid bare. Letitia wasn't family. She was property, something to be controlled. She looked at Daniel one more time. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them I'm your wife, not their servant. Tell them you value me. Stand up for me." The silence stretched out, painful and absolute. Daniel couldn't meet her eyes. "Just apologize, Letty. Let's not make this a big thing." And Letitia understood. with devastating clarity, that he never would stand up for her, that the man she'd married didn't exist, that she'd been conned, manipulated, brought here under false pretenses to be exactly what she'd become, free labor with no rights and no voice. "I'm not apologizing," she said quietly, "because I've done nothing wrong." She turned and walked out of the dining room, up the stairs, into the bedroom. She could hear raised voices below. Daniel and his mother arguing, Barbara's shrill commentary, the children's confusion. Letitia sat on the bed, her whole body shaking. She'd finally spoken her truth, and it had changed nothing. She was still trapped in this house, in this marriage, in this life. But something had shifted. A line had been crossed. She'd seen clearly what she was dealing with. A family that viewed her as less than human, and a husband who would never defend her. She'd spent 2 months being broken down, accepting abuse, trying to be good enough. That ended tonight. Letitia didn't know yet how she would escape, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't stay here. She wouldn't survive it. The door opened. Daniel entered, his face tight with anger. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. And for the first time since arriving in North Carolina, Letitia looked at her husband and felt nothing at all. "That was me waking up," she said. Chapter 5, The Liberation. Word count, 1,600 words. The house was silent when Letitia crept downstairs at 3 in the morning. She'd waited until Daniel's breathing became deep and steady, until she was certain everyone was asleep. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she descended the stairs, avoiding the spots that creaked. After the disastrous dinner 3 nights ago, Daniel had barely spoken to her. He'd spent the intervening days at work or out with Ryan, avoiding confrontation. Margaret and Barbara had treated her with icy silence, their disapproval palpable. The message was clear: fall back in line or suffer the consequences. But Letitia had spent those 3 days planning instead of submitting. She'd found Margaret's address book in the kitchen drawer, a leather-bound relic filled with handwritten contacts. Inside was a name that caught her attention: Father Miguel Santos, St. Catherine's Catholic Church. The only Catholic church in a sea of Baptist congregations, and the priest had a Portuguese surname. On Thursday morning, while Margaret and Barbara had gone to their Bible study, Letitia had walked 2 miles to St. Catherine's, a modest brick building on the edge of Winston-Salem's small Latino neighborhood. Father Miguel had been in the garden, tending to late-season tomatoes. He was in his 60s, with kind eyes and an accent that marked him as Brazilian. When Letitia had approached and spoken to him in Portuguese, his face had lit up with recognition and warmth. She'd told him everything. The entire sordid story poured out in her native language. The false promises, the servitude, the abuse, the isolation. She'd cried in his small office while he listened without judgment. "You're not the first," Father Miguel had said sadly. "This happens more than people know. Women brought here, trapped, exploited." "I have no money," Letitia had said. "No way to leave. My passport is locked in Margaret's desk. I've seen where she keeps it." "There are organizations that help women in your situation," Father Miguel had said, reaching for a card. "But you need to be ready. Once you start this process, there's no going back to that house." Now, 3 nights later, Letitia stood in Margaret's home office with a flashlight, her hands trembling as she picked the simple lock on the desk drawer. Inside was a metal box, also locked, but Letitia had watched Margaret punch in a code weeks ago, 1956, her birth year. The box opened. Inside were important documents: property deeds, insurance papers, and there, in a manila envelope, passports. Margaret's, Daniel's, Ryan's, and hers. The green Brazilian passport with her photo, her identity, her way home. She took only her passport, closed everything carefully, and returned to the bedroom. Daniel didn't stir as she slid the document into her purse. Friday morning arrived normally. Letitia made breakfast, served coffee, moved through her routine like a ghost. But at 9:30, when Margaret and Barbara left for shopping and Daniel was at work, she walked out the front door with nothing but her purse and the clothes on her back. She'd thought about taking her suitcase, her belongings, but decided against it. Things could be replaced. Freedom couldn't. The walk to St. Catherine's took 40 minutes. Father Miguel was waiting, along with a woman named Rosa, who worked for a nonprofit called Sisters Network that helped immigrant women escape abusive situations. "You're very brave," Rosa said in Portuguese. She was Mexican, around 50, with a no-nonsense manner that Leticia found comforting. What happens next won't be easy, but you'll be safe. Rosa drove Leticia to a shelter in Greensboro, a nondescript house in a residential neighborhood where women could stay while rebuilding their lives. The address was confidential, protected. Daniel and his family couldn't find her here. That first night, sleeping in a small room with just a bed and a dresser, Leticia felt fear and relief in equal measure. She'd left. She'd actually done it. By Monday, her phone was flooded with messages. Daniel, confused and angry. "Where are you?" "What's going on?" Margaret, imperious. "Come back immediately. This is unacceptable." Even Jessica had weighed in. "You're being ridiculous. Think about what you're throwing away." Throwing away what? A life of servitude? An absent husband? A family that treated her like property? Leticia blocked all their numbers. Rosa connected her with an immigration attorney named Patricia Chen, who took cases pro bono for abuse victims. Patricia was sharp and efficient, immediately filing paperwork to protect Leticia's immigration status. "Your marriage gives you rights," Patricia explained in their first meeting. "Even if Daniel tries to cause problems with your green card application, there are provisions for abuse victims. We'll document everything: the exploitation, the isolation, the financial control." "Will I have to see him?" Leticia asked. "Eventually, for divorce proceedings. But not until you're ready. For now, we focus on stabilizing your situation." The shelter had resources Leticia hadn't known existed: English classes specifically for immigrants, job training, therapy, a community of women who understood what she'd endured because they'd survived similar circumstances. There was Carmen from El Salvador, brought to North Carolina by a man who'd promised love but delivered violence. There was Yuki from Japan, whose in-laws had treated her like an indentured servant. There was Amara from Nigeria, isolated and controlled by a husband who monitored her every move. They shared meals and stories, cried together, laughed together, slowly rebuilt their sense of self-worth together. Leticia got a job at a Brazilian restaurant in Greensboro's International District. The owner, Dona Teresa, was a grandmother figure who understood without being told what Leticia had escaped from. The work was hard, long hours on her feet, dealing with demanding customers, but it was hers. She earned money that went into her own bank account. She made decisions about her own life. 3 months after leaving the Morrison house, Leticia moved into a tiny apartment in Greensboro. It was a studio in an older building, barely furnished, with thin walls and temperamental heating. But it was hers. When she locked the door at night, she was safe. When she woke in the morning, she decided how to spend her day. She'd learned that Daniel had called the police after she left, claiming she'd stolen property. The responding officers had taken a report but done nothing. Patricia had provided documentation of the abusive situation, and the police had seen enough of these cases to recognize the truth. Margaret had tried to freeze Leticia's green card application, but Patricia had countered with evidence of exploitation. The immigration case was proceeding slowly but surely. Daniel had filed for divorce, which Leticia welcomed. Patricia was fighting for compensation, back pay for the months of unpaid labor, reimbursement for belongings left behind. It would be a long battle, but Leticia was prepared to fight. On a Saturday in February, 6 months after her escape, Leticia sat in her small apartment with her laptop, Skyping with her sister Marina in Vancouver. "You look different," Marina said, studying Leticia's face through the screen. "Healthier." "I feel different," Leticia admitted. "I feel like myself again." "I'm so proud of you," Marina said, her eyes shining. "When you first got there and I could tell something was wrong, I was terrified. I didn't know how to help." "I had to help myself," Leticia said. "No one could do it for me." They talked for an hour about everything and nothing: Marina's kids, their father in Portugal, Leticia's new life, plans for Marina to visit in the spring, the possibility of Leticia eventually moving to Vancouver to be near family. After the call ended, Leticia stood at her small window, looking out at the Greensboro street below. It was snowing lightly, fat flakes drifting down to dust the parked cars and bare trees. North Carolina snow, which would probably melt by tomorrow. She thought about the woman who'd arrived at that airport 6 months ago. Hopeful, naive, so desperately wanting to be loved that she'd ignored every red flag. That woman had believed in fairy tales and Prince Charming and the power of love to overcome anything. Leticia wasn't that woman anymore. She'd learned that love without respect was worthless, that promises meant nothing without action, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk away from everything you'd invested in, admit you'd made a mistake, and start over. Her phone buzzed, a text from Carmen inviting her to a potluck dinner at the community center. Leticia smiled and responded yes. She had friends now, a community, people who saw her for who she really was. The apartment was small and the furniture was secondhand and her bank account was modest, but everything in this space was earned through her own labor, chosen by her own will, hers by right, rather than by sufferance. She'd come to America searching for a dream and found a nightmare instead. But she'd survived. More than survived. She'd escaped, rebuilt, reclaimed herself. Leticia Silva Morrison would soon be just Leticia Silva again. And this time she knew exactly who that was. A woman who'd crossed an ocean twice, who'd survived exploitation and emerged stronger, who'd learned that the only person who could truly save her was herself. She was 33 years old, starting over in a foreign country, facing an uncertain future. And for the first time in months, she was genuinely smiling, because she was free.